There is always a single moment, a quiet, internal, unspoken moment, when the empath's heart finally snaps, not in anger or drama, but in a deep, exhausted whisper that says, "I can't do this anymore." And this moment doesn't arrive suddenly. It arrives after carrying the weight of the entire relationship for far too long. Empaths endure more than most people can imagine. They absorb every emotional shift, every withdrawal, every hint of coldness. They rationalize the avoidance behavior, trying to understand it, trying to soothe it, trying to protect the connection even when they're hurting the most. They convince themselves that love means patience, understanding, and endless compassion. But every time they soothe someone else's storm, they drown a little more in their own. At first, the empath doesn't even notice they're breaking. They normalize the avoidance distance. They tell themselves, they're just stressed, or they're not ready, or if I just hold on a little longer, they'll finally open up. They excuse the emotional starvation because that's what empaths do. They love deeply, even when it costs them pieces of themselves. But the heart can only stretch so far before it begins to tear, and the empath starts to feel something new beneath all the giving depletion. A quiet emptiness, a growing awareness that they are pouring into someone who doesn't meet them halfway. The empath starts noticing how often they apologize just to keep the peace. How often they silence their own needs to avoid triggering the avoidance discomfort. How often they minimize their feelings to protect someone who never protected theirs. The emotional labor feels heavier with every interaction. The empath keeps pushing through because they believe in the connection, but a truth begins to form beneath the surface. A truth they try to ignore, but can't forever. They realize they are the only one fighting for the relationship, and then the moment arrives. Not during an argument, not during a dramatic incident, not during a heartbreak. It happens in the quietest, smallest instant, maybe after reading a distant message, maybe after feeling dismissed again, maybe after realizing their emotions were brushed aside one more time. It's a subtle but powerful realization. I'm tired, not just frustrated, but drained. This is not love anymore. This is survival. In that moment, something inside the empath shifts permanently. The emotional string that kept them tied to the avoidant loosens. Their heart stops reaching, stops stretching, stops trying to carry the connection alone. The empath doesn't hate the avoidant. They don't resent them. They simply stop fighting a battle they finally realized they were fighting alone. And that clarity becomes the snap. This is not a loud break. It's not explosive. It's internal and irreversible. The empath's heart quietly closes a door the avoidant never thought could shut. The empath doesn't announce it. They don't warn anyone. They don't express it dramatically. They just emotionally detach. The same empath who once stayed through everything simply loses the capacity to keep giving. And once that internal snap happens, they cannot force themselves back into the old version of themselves who would have tolerated anything just to keep the connection alive. This moment is the turning point, when the empath stops bending, stops explaining, stops overextending. This is the moment the empath becomes the one who withdraws, and the avoidant who believed the empath would always remain there has no idea that something permanent has just shifted. The empath's heart, once open and giving, now quietly chooses self-preservation over sacrifice, and no amount of guilt, pressure, or longing can undo that internal decision once it's made. The empath never intends to become distant. They never plan to pull back, detach, or stop pouring into the relationship. In fact, for most of the connection, they do the exact opposite. They carry it. They carry the emotional weight the avoidant refuses to hold. They carry the conversations, the reassurance, the patience, the vulnerability, the hope. They become the anchor, the healer, the emotional translator. They feel everything so deeply that they instinctively take responsibility for the emotional health of both people. And for a long time, this feels natural to them. It feels like love. It feels like their role. It feels like something they can sustain. But slowly, quietly, without any dramatic signs, something begins to shift inside them. Carrying the relationship alone starts changing who they are, not because they want it to, but because no one can keep giving endlessly without something inside them eventually running empty. At first, the empath believes the avoidant just needs understanding. They think, maybe they're scared, or maybe they're not used to closeness, or maybe if I just stay consistent, they'll eventually feel safe. So the empath tries harder. They offer more patience, more gentleness, more reassurance. They absorb the avoidant's silence, distance, and defensive behavior. They reduce their needs to avoid overwhelming the avoidant. They minimize their emotions to avoid conflict. They do everything in their power to keep the connection alive. And still, nothing changes. The avoidant stays distant, unresponsive, or inconsistent. The empath notices the imbalance, but instead of pulling back, they push forward. Because empaths are wired to fix what feels broken. But carrying the relationship alone has a cost. Emotional labor becomes emotional exhaustion. The empath begins feeling drained in ways they cannot explain. They start questioning themselves, asking why loving someone feels like climbing a mountain alone. They start feeling guilty for needing anything at all. They begin to suppress their natural desire for closeness because they know it will send the avoidant into retreat. They start shrinking themselves to fit inside someone else's emotional limitations. And with each sacrifice, the empath loses a little more of their own emotional safety. Then, the confusion sets in. The empath wonders why they always feel anxious around someone they care about. They wonder why they're constantly second, guessing their tone, their timing, their words. They notice how often they apologize for simply expressing a feeling. They start noticing how much effort they give compared to how little they receive. And somewhere deep inside, a realization begins to form: I am loving someone who doesn't know how to love me back. This realization doesn't make them pull away immediately. Empaths always give second chances, then third, then 10th. They keep believing in the potential of the connection. They keep hoping the avoidant will finally reciprocate. They keep trying to be understanding, even when it hurts. But with each cycle, closeness, avoidance, disappointment, repair, temporary calm, the empath's emotional energy decreases. What once felt like loving now feels like surviving. What once felt manageable now feels like painful self-betrayal. The emotional burnout grows slowly but steadily. Eventually, something inside the empath begins disconnecting, not because they stop caring, but because the body and heart cannot sustain emotional overwork forever. Carrying the relationship alone becomes too heavy. The empath realizes they are giving everything while receiving almost nothing. They realize they are holding an entire bond together with their bare hands. And that weight, over time, transforms the empath's entire emotional posture. They begin to pull away without meaning to. They stop explaining themselves. They stop fixing every issue. They stop initiating. They stop waiting for the avoidant to finally meet them halfway. They stop feeling hopeful, and instead, they start feeling numb. Emotional burnout turns into detachment, a quiet, subtle, internal withdrawal that happens long before the empath ever physically steps back. Carrying the relationship alone is the very force that turns an empath into the avoidant. It's not a decision. It's not revenge. It's not punishment. It's the natural consequence of trying to love someone who refuses to join them in the connection. And once this shift begins, the empath cannot return to who they were. Not because they don't want to, but because the emotional burnout has fundamentally changed them. Emotional burnout in an empath doesn't look like fire, rage, or dramatic exits. It looks like silence. It looks like stillness. It looks like a soft but final shutting down of the emotional door they kept open far longer than they should have. Empaths don't detach because they stop loving. They detach because they stop surviving inside a connection that feeds on their emotional labor while starving their emotional needs. And what makes this moment so powerful is that it doesn't come with warning signs the avoidant can recognize. It happens internally, invisibly, quietly, and by the time anyone notices, the empath is already gone on the inside. For the empath, the beginning of this emotional shutdown is subtle. They start feeling more tired than hopeful. They stop having the energy to decode mixed signals. They stop feeling the same spark when the avoidant returns after disappearing. They stop fantasizing about what could be and start acknowledging what is. Their heart no longer jumps when they get a message. Their nervous system no longer relaxes when they hear the avoidant's voice. Something feels different, but the empath can't name it yet. They just feel a numbness replacing the enthusiasm that once carried the entire relationship. Then something shifts deeper. The empath realizes they are no longer willing to explain themselves. They stop rehearsing what to say to avoid triggering the avoidant. They stop hiding their hurt to keep the peace. They stop pretending that inconsistency is acceptable. The emotional exhaustion becomes so overwhelming that numbness becomes the only escape. And numbness, for an empath, is terrifying at first, because feeling deeply was always their identity. But after months or years of giving, numbness feels like relief. It feels like finally being able to breathe without waiting for the next emotional blow. This numbness is not coldness, it's self-protection. The empath reaches a point where their heart simply refuses to stretch any further. And once the empath detaches emotionally, even if they still show up physically, the entire energy shifts. The avoidant senses it immediately, even if they can't articulate it. The empath becomes harder to read, harder to manipulate, harder to guilt, harder to pull into the same repetitive cycles. The avoidant no longer feels the emotional grip they were once able to rely on. The empath's softness turns into neutrality. Their warmth turns into distance. Their forgiveness turns into indifference. Once burnout replaces blind hope, the empath no longer waits for the avoidant to change. They stop believing empty promises. They stop chasing clarity. They stop arguing. They stop explaining their pain. They stop offering emotional cushions. They stop trying to win someone who wasn't even participating. And it's not a loud moment, it's an internal resignation. A quiet acceptance of the reality they have been avoiding. The empath suddenly sees the truth. They were holding on to potential, not partnership. They were nurturing someone who would not nurture them back. They were sacrificing themselves for a love that required their self-abandonment to survive. And once they see this truth, the attachment dissolves. It doesn't break, it unravels. Thread by thread, memory by memory, hope by hope. By the time the avoidant realizes the empath is slipping away, the empath has already emotionally left the connection. They no longer feel the same pull. They no longer feel the same urgency. They no longer feel responsible for the avoidant's emotional comfort. And this internal detachment is irreversible. Because once an empath reaches emotional burnout, their heart rewires itself for self-preservation. The empath doesn't become harsh. They become unavailable. They don't become unkind. They become unreachable. They don't become cold. They become done. And the tragic irony is this: the avoidant only realizes what they had when the empath stops trying. But by then, the empath's burnout has already turned them into someone who cannot, and will not, go back to their old version, no matter how much love remains. When the empath finally reaches the point where detachment replaces devotion, the entire dynamic flips in a way the avoidant never saw coming. For the longest time, the avoidant operated with a quiet confidence, the belief that the empath would always be there. The belief that no matter how distant they became, no matter how inconsistent they acted, no matter how many times they withdrew, the empath would continue showing up with open arms, gentle words, and endless emotional availability. The avoidant depended on the empath's softness without ever acknowledging it. They counted on the empath's patience without ever appreciating it. They relied on the empath's resilience without ever realizing how fragile it was becoming. And then one day, the empath's energy shifts, and that shift exposes the avoidant in ways nothing else could. This is the role reversal. The moment when the empath becomes the distant one, and the avoidant suddenly finds themselves confronted with emotions they've spent years avoiding. The empath no longer leans in. They no longer chase. They no longer ask for clarity or reassurance. They no longer fight to be understood. Their energy becomes neutral instead of nurturing. Their presence becomes measured instead of overflowing. Their emotional availability shrinks into something small, quiet and self-protective. And the avoidant, who once found comfort in emotional distance, now finds it unsettling. Avoidants are used to being in control of the emotional pacing. They decide when to come close and when to pull away. They dictate the rhythm of the connection, creating a cycle where they retreat and the empath follows. But when the empath stops following, everything inside the avoidant begins to unravel. Their sense of control vanishes. Their emotional patterns break. Their usual escape routes no longer soothe them. They feel something they've spent a lifetime avoiding: vulnerability. The avoidant becomes acutely aware of the empath's withdrawal. Suddenly, the silence feels heavier. The space they once demanded feels too wide. The distance they created feels like a loss they didn't anticipate. The empath's emotional absence exposes a truth: the avoidant wasn't ready to face. The connection was never sustained by both people. It was held together by one, and that person is no longer holding on. The avoidant starts feeling anxious in ways they can't explain. They notice the empath's shorter replies. They notice the lack of emotional warmth. They notice the absence of reassurance. They notice the empath isn't seeking closeness anymore. They notice the empath isn't waiting for them. For the first time, the avoidant becomes the one who wonders, what's happening? Why do I feel off? Why aren't they reaching out? Why do I feel so exposed? This exposure terrifies them because it strips away the emotional shield they've relied on their entire life. They can no longer hide behind excuses, shutdowns, or distance. The empath's new boundaries act like a mirror, forcing the avoidant to confront their own emotional patterns without distraction. The avoidant begins to experience the very sensations the empath carried along: uncertainty, fear of loss, emotional imbalance, the painful awareness that something meaningful is slipping away. They feel the absence of the empath's love like a cold draft in a room they never realized was held together by warmth. The avoidant suddenly feels small in the dynamic, not powerful, not distant, but genuinely afraid. And this is where the reversal hits hardest. The avoidant finally realizes that their emotional safety always depended on the empath's willingness to absorb the chaos. Without the empath's energy pulling the connection forward, the avoidant feels unanchored. The same silence they once created now echoes back at them, and they don't know what to do with the emptiness. Their usual defenses don't work because the empath is no longer chasing. There is nothing to run from because the empath is no longer running toward them. The roles have reversed so deeply that the avoidant now becomes the one who feels exposed, uncertain, and emotionally unprepared. The empath isn't punishing them, they're protecting themselves, and in protecting themselves, they inadvertently trigger the avoidant's deepest fear, not intimacy, but losing someone who once made intimacy feel safe. Once this reversal happens, the avoidant cannot pretend they are unaffected, and they cannot undo the shift, because the empath, now protectively avoidant, is no longer operating from a place of longing. They are operating from a place of clarity, and that clarity becomes the emotional distance the avoidant never expected and suddenly doesn't know how to live without. When an empath finally chooses self-protection over self-sacrifice, something irreversible happens inside them, a psychological shift so deep that even they cannot return to the person they used to be. Empaths are wired to love deeply, give generously, and forgive endlessly. But once they reach the point where they must protect their own heart in order to survive emotionally, their nervous system rewrites the rules. They no longer experience the relationship the way they once did. They no longer feel the instinct to fix, to chase, to absorb, to tolerate. And this shift is not something they can reverse by willpower. It is not a choice, it is an emotional evolution. For most of the relationship, the empath's identity revolves around being the emotional caretaker. They pride themselves on their ability to understand, heal, comfort, and empathize. They feel responsible for maintaining harmony. They believe love means patience and compassion. They believe that if they just love harder, communicate better, or stay softer, the avoidant will eventually meet them halfway. So they keep giving even when it hurts. They keep trying long after the avoidant has stopped. They keep hoping long after the emotional reality has already changed. And they do all of this because loving deeply is their nature. But every empath has a limit, a painful tipping point where something inside them breaks so quietly that even the avoidant doesn't hear it. This break isn't anger. It isn't revenge. It isn't even disappointment. It's a kind of emotional exhaustion so complete that their heart simply refuses to stretch anymore. When they reach this limit, their system flips into self-preservation. They lose the ability to overextend themselves emotionally. They lose the ability to ignore their own needs. They lose the ability to romanticize potential. They lose the ability to pretend the avoidance behavior is something they can continue tolerating. And once this happens, they cannot go back. The empath's mind shifts first. They start seeing patterns clearly, not through the fog of love, but through the lens of reality. They recognize the imbalance they once justified. They see the emotional starvation they normalized. They understand that no matter how much they gave, it never inspired the avoidant to grow. They finally recognize the emotional loneliness they lived with. And once the mind sees what it had been denying, the heart follows. Their emotional tolerance collapses. Their patience dries up. Their desire to fix dies quietly. Their emotional availability narrows into something intentional and limited. The empath doesn't suddenly become cold. They become aware. They don't become distant out of spite. They become distant because the old version of them can't survive anymore. They don't stop loving. They stop abandoning themselves in the name of love. Self-protection becomes their new instinct. They stop explaining what the avoidant refuses to understand. They stop waiting for reciprocity that never comes. They stop offering comfort to someone who never offered it back. They stop showing up to a dynamic that required self-betrayal to function. And once they begin protecting themselves, the avoidant's old behaviors no longer have the same power. What once pulled the empath in now pushes them away. What once kept them hopeful now feels empty. What once made them fight now makes them leave. The avoidant often believes that the empath will return to who they were if given enough time, but this is the deepest misunderstanding. Once the empath has felt the emotional cost of carrying a relationship alone, they cannot unfeel it. Once they've seen the truth of the dynamic, they cannot unsee it. Once self-respect rises inside them, it cannot be lowered again to fit someone else's comfort. The empath doesn't lose their ability to love. They lose their willingness to love in ways that destroy them. They don't stop caring. They stop caring enough to tolerate emotional neglect. They don't stop feeling. They stop feeling responsible for someone else's emotional immaturity. And that is why the empath can never go back to the old them. Because the old them was built on self-abandonment, and the new them is built on self-protection. There comes a point in the empath journey where returning to the old dynamic is no longer possible, not because the love is gone, but because something deeper, stronger, and more necessary has taken its place: self-respect. This final shift is the quiet earthquake that reshapes everything. It doesn't roar, it doesn't explode, it doesn't announce itself. It unfolds in silence, in clarity, in the calm recognition that going back to the old version of the relationship would require the empath to betray themselves all over again. And once an empath truly understands the cost of that self-betrayal, they cannot make that sacrifice anymore. No matter how much history exists, no matter how much longing remains, no matter how much the avoidant suddenly wants to change. The avoidant expects the empath to return to the old pattern, because the pattern benefited the avoidant. The pattern gave them emotional space without accountability. It allowed them to withdraw without consequences. It allowed them to receive comfort without offering it. It allowed them to keep the empath close without having to show up fully. So when the empath stops chasing, the avoidant believes it's temporary. When the empath becomes distant, the avoidant believes it's emotional overwhelm. When the empath detaches, the avoidant believes they just need reassurance or time. But they fail to grasp the truth: this shift is not temporary. It is transformational. The empath has crossed an emotional threshold. The old dynamic cannot be rebuilt because it was built on imbalance, on unequal emotional effort, on the empath's willingness to shrink themselves to protect the avoidant's comfort. Returning to that dynamic would mean lowering their standards, quieting their needs, and suppressing their truth. All things the empath once did automatically but no longer can. Their system rejects it. Their heart rejects it. Their body rejects it. Once the empath experiences the peace that comes from choosing themselves, chaos no longer feels like love. And this is the moment the avoidant never prepared for. They believed the empath's love was infinite. They believed the empath's patience was guaranteed. They believed the empath's loyalty would outweigh the pain. They never expected the empath to change roles. They never expected the empath to become the one who values space, silence, and independence more than closeness. They never expected the empath's love to evolve into self-preservation. And because of this, the avoidant mistakes the empath's detachment for coldness when it is actually clarity. They mistake it for punishment when it is actually healing. They mistake it for disinterest when it is actually self-repair. The empath doesn't stop loving the avoidant. They stop loving in a way that hurts them. They no longer cling to promises. They no longer wait for potential. They no longer justify inconsistency. They no longer feel responsible for holding up the emotional world of someone who refuses to hold up their own. The empath still feels deeply, but they no longer feel obligated. They still care, but they no longer overextend. They still remember the connection, but they no longer live in its memory. This transformation is not about giving up. It's about growing up emotionally. It's not about losing faith in love. It's about finding faith in themselves. It's not about shutting the avoidant out. It's about opening the door inward. And once that door opens, once the empath experiences the strength of self-respect, once they feel how liberating it is to no longer abandon themselves in the name of love, they cannot go back to the version of themselves who tolerated pain in silence. The avoidant may apologize, they may reach out, they may promise change. They may show vulnerability they never showed before. But even then, the empath cannot step back into the old dynamic, because the old dynamic was built on the empath sacrificing themselves. And that person no longer exists. The empath's love didn't die, it evolved. It became wiser, quieter, more selective. It became a love that requires reciprocity, emotional honesty, and maturity. A love that cannot survive in the environment it once tolerated. A love that refuses to shrink to fit inside wounds it did not create. This is the final truth the avoidant never sees until it's too late. When the empath chooses self-respect, the old cycle ends forever. And no matter how much love remains, the empath can never return to the version of themselves that broke trying to keep the relationship alive.